Keanu Reeves had always cherished the quiet moments, the rare hours away from the flashing lights and bustling world of Hollywood. This morning was no different. The sun had barely risen, casting a soft golden light over the empty park as Keanu strolled along the path, Max, his German shepherd, trotting happily by his side. It was just him and the dog, a peaceful silence enveloping them as they wandered through the trees, the only sounds the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. Keanu had adopted Max just a few months ago, and already the two had become inseparable. Max wasn't just a dog, he was family. The bond between them had grown stronger with each passing day, as if Max had been waiting for Keanu to come into his life, just as Keanu had been waiting for Max. There was something about the dog's quiet strength that mirrored Keanu's own, an unspoken understanding, a sense of calm in a chaotic world. As they reached a clearing, Keanu stopped for a moment, letting Max run ahead. He smiled, watching the dog bound through the grass, tail wagging carefree. Keanu's thoughts wandered, reflecting on how much his life had changed in the last year. From the whirlwind of movie promotions and interviews to the stillness of early mornings like this, there was a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time, but that peace, as often happens, wouldn't last. Out of the corner of his eye, Keanu spotted 3 men approaching. At first they seemed harmless, just some guys out for a walk, but something about their demeanor felt off. They moved with a purpose, their eyes scanning the surroundings, never quite settling on the peaceful scene before them. Keanu instinctively pulled Max closer, his hand tightening around the leash. "Hey you," one of the men called out, his voice rough, grating. "Nice dog? You mind if we pet him?" Keanu's smile remained polite but reserved. "He's not really a fan of strangers," Keanu replied, his tone calm, measured. The man didn't seem to take the hint. He stepped closer, his eyes scanning Keanu from head to toe. The others flanked him, their movements a little too synchronized, a little too deliberate. Something about this felt wrong. Max's ears perked up, sensing the tension in the air, and the dog's tail stopped wagging. "We're not here to hurt you," another man said, though the words didn't sound reassuring. "We're just looking for some fun, you know?" Keanu's instincts kicked in, a slight shift in his body language signaling that he wasn't willing to entertain any of their games. He took a step back, subtly positioning himself between the men and Max. "I think you should keep walking," Keanu said, his voice steady but firm. "This is a public park, but I don't appreciate being harassed." The men paused, eyeing him with a mix of amusement and irritation. The one who had spoken first smirked, taking a step forward. "Come on, man. Don't be like that. We're just having some fun. You've got a nice watch there, don't you think?" Keanu's hand instinctively brushed the sleeve of his jacket, his thumb brushing against the silver bracelet on his wrist. The man's eyes followed the movement, and Keanu knew exactly what was happening. They were eyeing him as a target. The polite requests had turned into thinly veiled threats. This was no longer a casual encounter. Max growled lowly, a sound that made the air grow thick with tension. The men froze for a moment, realizing that the dog was no ordinary pet. Keanu felt the leash tighten in his hand. "He's not just a dog," Keanu said, his voice lowering. "You might want to reconsider." The men exchanged glances, sizing up the situation. They had seen famous faces before, and they didn't seem particularly intimidated by Keanu's presence. They were looking for something, whether it was money, a chance to embarrass him, or perhaps a bigger, more sinister plan. They weren't here to make friends. Keanu took another step back, moving further away from the men, keeping Max close. The last thing he wanted was to escalate things, but the air around them was thick with hostility. There was no telling what these guys might do next. Then one of the men made a move. "All right, enough of this," the first man snapped, taking a step forward, his hands outstretched. "We're not asking anymore." Keanu's mind raced. This wasn't just a robbery. Something about their posture, their eyes, this was an attack. And Max, sensing the danger, was already in position, ready to protect. But Keanu didn't want to jump into a fight. He'd always preferred to avoid conflict when he could, but now there was no choice. The calm of the morning was shattered, and whatever happened next would change everything. Keanu looked down at Max, meeting the dog's calm gaze. In that moment, he knew he wasn't alone. Max wasn't just a pet, he was family, and it was time to defend that bond. The storm was coming. The moment the first man lunged toward Keanu, Max was already in motion. The dog's training took over. There was no hesitation, no second thought. Max leapt forward, teeth bared, and grabbed the man by the arm with a swift, controlled bite. The attacker cried out in shock and pain, stumbling backward, his face twisting in disbelief. "Get him off me," the man yelled, trying to shake Max off, but the dog's grip was unrelenting. Max had been trained for moments like this, and Keanu had no idea just how skilled the dog truly was until now. The other two men hesitated for a fraction of a second, staring at Max in stunned silence, unsure of what to do. That hesitation was all Keanu needed. He stepped forward, his hand still gripping the leash, and said in a low, steady voice, "Stay back." But the men didn't listen. One of them, a taller figure with a scruffy beard, pulled a knife from his jacket pocket. The cold steel glinted in the morning light. Keanu's heart raced, but he kept his calm. The years of playing action roles had honed his instincts, but nothing could have fully prepared him for this situation. His thoughts flashed between the escalating threat and his duty to keep Max and himself safe. "Don't do this," Keanu warned, his voice firm but filled with a quiet authority. "You don't want to go down this road." The man with the knife grinned wickedly, stepping closer. "We're already on this road, buddy." He flicked the knife in his hand, testing its weight, a taunting smile spreading across his face. Max growled louder, tightening his grip on the first man's arm, and the attacker let out a yelp of pain, trying to free himself. That was the moment the second man made a fatal mistake. Thinking they could overwhelm Keanu, he rushed at him, trying to land a punch. But Max was too fast. With a quick lunge, the dog shifted his grip, releasing the first man to slam his body into the second attacker. Keanu barely had time to react. He watched as Max's body hit the second man with the force of a battering ram. The man crumpled to the ground, dazed and disoriented. Max didn't stop there. The dog was on top of him in an instant, keeping him pinned to the ground with a determined, professional hold. Keanu couldn't help but feel a rush of gratitude toward Max. But the danger wasn't over. The third man, now more desperate, raised his knife and advanced on Keanu. This wasn't a simple robbery anymore. This was a fight for survival. The blade flashed as the man swung it toward Keanu's side. Keanu instinctively stepped back, narrowly, avoiding the slashing blade. In one fluid motion, he reached for the ground, grabbing a fallen branch. He swung it at the attacker with surprising force, knocking the knife out of the man's hand and sending it skittering across the pavement. The man took a step back, his eyes wide with both fury and fear. He wasn't expecting Keanu to fight back so skillfully, and now the odds were starting to shift. "Enough," the man barked, but his voice wavered, as if the reality of their situation was starting to dawn on him. Keanu stood his ground, watching the man carefully, the branch still gripped tightly in his hand. Max, still pinning the second man down, let out another deep growl, the sound vibrating through the air. It was clear that the remaining attacker wasn't going to back down easily, but Keanu wasn't about to give him the chance. "You really want to keep going?" Keanu asked, his voice cold and steady. "I'm not the one you should be worried about." The man hesitated, his gaze flicking to Max, who was now standing at attention, his eyes locked onto the attacker with unwavering focus. The dog's teeth glistened in the early morning light, and the menace in his stance was palpable. Keanu could see the doubt creeping into the man's eyes. But then, just as things seemed to reach a standstill, Max did something unexpected. With a sudden, powerful bark, he lunged forward, not at the man with the knife, but at the man he had previously pinned to the ground. The dog's sudden movement knocked the wind out of the attacker, and before he could react, Max was back on top of him, maintaining his grip with ruthless efficiency. The third man, now visibly shaken, backed away slowly, his hands raised in surrender. All right, we're done, okay? Just call off your dog, man." Keanu kept his eyes on him, his body tense but under control. "Get out of here," he said, his voice steady but laced with the authority that only someone who had seen enough of the world's darkness could carry. The men, realizing they were outmatched, began to retreat, dragging their injured companion along with them. The third man cast one last fearful glance at Max before they disappeared down the path, leaving Keanu and his dog standing alone in the quiet park. Keanu let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, the tension draining from his body. He glanced down at Max, who was standing beside him, his body still coiled, ready for any further threat. "You okay, buddy?" Keanu asked, his voice softening as he looked down at the dog. Max's tail gave a subtle wag as if to say, "I'm fine." But Keanu knew better. Max wasn't just fine, he had just saved them both. Keanu knelt down, gently running his hand over Max's head. "You really are something else," he muttered, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. The calm of the morning had evaporated, replaced by a deep, unexpected bond between man and dog. The attack had been a shock, a brutal, sudden reminder of how dangerous the world could be. But through it all, Max had been there, fierce and loyal, a protector in the truest sense. Keanu realized that life had just thrown him a curveball, and Max was the unexpected hero who had already proven his worth. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, Keanu's mind began to race. Who were those men? Why had they targeted him? And most importantly, would they come back? Max nudged him gently, as if sensing his growing concern. Keanu stood up, adjusting his jacket. It seemed like this peaceful morning wasn't going to end quietly after all. There were questions now, unanswered questions that would need to be dealt with. But for now, Keanu took comfort in the fact that he wasn't alone. Max was by his side, and together they were ready for whatever came next. The morning sun had risen higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the park as Keanu and Max made their way back toward his car. His heart was still racing from the unexpected encounter, the adrenaline slowly starting to wear off, leaving behind an unsettling feeling. He kept a close eye on the path behind him, as if expecting the men to come charging back at any moment. But they hadn't. They'd vanished as quickly as they had appeared, leaving Keanu with more questions than answers. As they reached the parking lot, Keanu stopped. He glanced down at Max, who was now walking beside him with a calm, almost regal demeanor, as if the events of the last few minutes hadn't rattled him at all. The dog's alertness hadn't wavered, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings, his nose twitching at the scent of the air. "All right, buddy. What's going on?" Keanu muttered to himself. The encounter had been too strange, too precise, for just some random thugs looking to rob someone. There had been intent in their actions, something deeper than just a robbery. Keanu's gut told him there was something more to the situation than a simple attack. Keanu reached his car and unlocked it, but before he could open the door, something caught his eye. On the ground near the back tire, he spotted a small object, something metal, half hidden under a pile of leaves. He bent down to examine it, and was surprised to find a small badge, half crushed and worn, with the faint imprint of a police logo on it. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just any badge, it looked like a police badge. Keanu's mind raced. Why would one of those men have dropped a police badge? It didn't make sense. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a random encounter. Someone had gone out of their way to target him, and there was no way it was a coincidence. Keanu picked up the badge carefully, examining it closely. It was old and worn, the edges chipped from years of use, but it was unmistakable. This was a badge that had seen action, and it looked like it had been discarded in a hurry. But why? Why would someone want to hide their identity with a police badge? He turned the badge over in his hands, searching for any markings or clues that might explain its presence here. A number was etched into the back, 2137. It was the only lead he had, but it was a start. "Max, what do you think?" Keanu asked aloud, though he knew the dog couldn't answer. Still, Max looked up at him, his expression focused, his ears alert. Keanu stood up, tucking the badge into his jacket pocket. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to get them by standing around. His phone vibrated in his pocket, snapping him out of his thoughts. He pulled it out and saw that it was an unfamiliar number. It was probably one of those robbers trying to track him down, or maybe it was someone trying to make sense of the chaotic situation. He answered it with a guarded tone. "Hello?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line before a deep, gravelly voice replied, "Mr. Reeves, I assume?" Keanu's pulse quickened. Something about the voice sent a chill down his spine. "Who is this?" "My name is Detective Daniels. I'm with the local police department. I need to speak with you about something important." Keanu's mind immediately went to the badge he had found moments ago. Was this just a coincidence, or was there a connection between the badge and the man on the phone? "I'm listening," Keanu said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I understand you had an encounter this morning," the detective continued. "We've been tracking a group of individuals, men who've been targeting high-profile figures in the area. But this isn't just about robbery, Mr. Reeves. There's a larger issue at play." Keanu's heart raced again. This wasn't just some random mugging, then. The detective's tone was urgent, and that only made Keanu more suspicious. "What kind of issue?" "The kind of issue that involves more than just petty criminals. We believe these men are connected to a much bigger operation, one that includes former law enforcement officers who've gone rogue." The detective paused. "Including someone who used to work for the department you just found that badge from." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. The badge had once belonged to a cop. But why would they want to target him? He wasn't just some ordinary citizen. He was an actor, a public figure, someone who wouldn't normally attract this kind of attention. "What does this have to do with me?" Keanu asked, his voice sharp. His mind was running through a dozen different possibilities, but none of them made sense. "We believe you've been marked as a target because of your recent involvement with a certain individual," the detective said, his voice lowering as if afraid of being overheard. "A former police officer who has gone off the grid, someone who might have a score to settle." Keanu's mind flashed back to the early days with Max. The dog had been rescued from a shelter, but there were details about his past that Keanu had never fully understood. The idea that Max could be tied to this situation was both shocking and deeply unsettling. Could it be possible that Max, the very dog who had saved him just hours earlier, had a history he didn't know about? "Max?" Keanu whispered to himself, more in disbelief than anything else. The detective's words hung heavy in the air. "Listen," the detective continued, "I need to meet with you, Mr. Reeves. We're trying to get ahead of this before it escalates further. But you need to be careful. You're in more danger than you realize." The line went quiet for a moment, as if the detective was waiting for Keanu to respond. But Keanu couldn't speak. His mind was too full, too overwhelmed by everything that had just been revealed. He needed to understand what this all meant, not just for him, but for Max as well. Max, his loyal companion, had always been there. For him. But what if the dog had a past that Keanu never knew about? What if the rescue dog who had saved his life was more than just a former police officer's companion? Keanu glanced down at Max, who was sitting at his feet, looking up at him with those wise, knowing eyes. Suddenly, everything felt like it was connected. His quiet life, the attack, the badge, and now this cryptic phone call. There was only one way to find out for sure. "We'll meet," Keanu said, his voice steady, his resolve hardening. "Tell me where." And with that, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, each revelation leading them deeper into a mystery neither of them could have anticipated. Keanu hung up the phone, his hand still gripping the device, his mind racing. He hadn't expected any of this. A police badge, a rogue ex-officer, and now a cryptic warning about his loyal dog. It was as if his life had suddenly morphed into one of the action-packed scripts he'd spent years reading. Except this time, it wasn't a character he was playing. It was real. Max nudged Keanu's leg gently, bringing him back to the present. The dog's eyes were locked on him with a calm that felt almost too wise for a simple pet. Keanu knelt down beside him, feeling the soft fur beneath his fingers. But for the first time since their bond began, he didn't feel the deep sense of comfort he was used to. There was too much unknown now. "What's going on with you, Max?" Keanu whispered, though he knew the dog couldn't answer. But the look in Max's eyes suggested the dog had always known more than Keanu realized. Max's tail thumped against the ground, breaking the silence, a quiet, reassuring gesture that gave Keanu a moment of peace. Still, Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than he could comprehend. Keanu stood up, glancing around the parking lot. The once peaceful morning felt unnervingly empty now. The events of the last hour had changed everything, and the quiet emptiness only seemed to amplify the growing tension. He needed to figure out what was going on, and quickly. His car door creaked as he opened it, the noise slicing through the stillness. Keanu tossed his jacket into the back seat, thinking about the detective's words. He could still hear the man's voice in his head. "You're in more danger than you realize." Keanu started the engine, the low rumble of the car vibrating through the seat. As he pulled out of the parking lot, his mind wandered back to Max's past. If Max had truly been a former police officer's dog, then what else had been hidden? From him? How had Max ended up in the shelter, and why hadn't anyone mentioned his past? The answers weren't easy to come by, but Keanu knew one thing for sure. He couldn't afford to be naive about it anymore. Max wasn't just some dog he had rescued. There was a history there, and it was entangled in something much bigger than a simple case of animal adoption. Keanu's phone buzzed again, interrupting his thoughts. This time it was a text message from an unknown number. "Meet me at the old warehouse on Oak Street, 2 p.m. Don't bring anyone. It's your best chance." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. The detective's instructions were clear. No backup, no distractions, just him and whatever answers were waiting at the warehouse. Oak Street was on the edge of town, a place that had seen better days. The area was run down, full of abandoned buildings and graffiti-covered walls. It wasn't the type of place anyone should go alone, especially in the middle of the afternoon. But Keanu didn't have much of a choice. Max's ears perked up, as if he knew where they were heading. Keanu could sense the dog's unease as he drove, the air between them thick with the weight of unspoken thoughts. When Keanu reached the warehouse district, the sight of the decaying buildings only intensified his growing anxiety. Oak Street was eerily quiet, the sound of tires on cracked. Asphalt the only thing breaking the stillness. As Keanu turned a corner, he spotted the warehouse in the distance, just as dilapidated as the others around it, but the door to the building was slightly ajar. A flicker of movement caught Keanu's eye, but when he blinked, it was gone. He pulled into a nearby alley, parking his car behind a stack of crates to stay out of sight. Max was already alert, his body tensed, and his gaze fixed on the dark opening of the warehouse. The dog's nostrils flared, catching scents Keanu couldn't even begin to understand. But whatever Max smelled, it made him uneasy. Keanu grabbed his jacket from the back seat and checked the small bag he always carried. He had a gun, just in case, though he hoped he wouldn't need it. It was moments like these when Keanu wished he were just playing a part in a movie, where the lines were scripted and the bad guys could easily be identified. But real life didn't have a script, and there were no guarantees. Max whined softly, breaking Keanu's concentration. The dog was now staring directly at him, waiting for his next move. "You ready?" Keanu asked, more for his own reassurance than anything else. Max let out a low growl, but his tail remained steady behind him. It was as if Max had always known there would come a time when they had to face whatever was hiding in the shadows. Keanu reached over and ruffled the dog's fur, his fingers brushing against the worn-out collar Max wore, a collar that had seen more than its fair share of danger. Keanu opened the car door slowly, stepping out into the cool afternoon air. The world around him felt quieter than it had any right to be. He glanced around, then started toward the warehouse, his steps deliberate and cautious. Max followed him closely, every muscle in the dog's body coiled and ready for action. They neared the entrance of the warehouse. Keanu's phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a message, it was a call. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Keanu," the voice on the other end was the same detective from earlier. "Don't go in there. It's a trap." Keanu froze. His blood ran cold. "Too late," Keanu muttered, glancing at the cracked door of the warehouse, his hand gripping Max's leash tightly. He wasn't sure if he was walking into an ambush or if this was the moment when everything would finally come together. But one thing was clear. He wasn't going to back down. The detective's voice came again, a hint of desperation now in his tone. "You don't know what you're dealing with. This isn't just about you anymore. You're connected to something much bigger than you realize." Keanu didn't respond. Instead, he pushed the door open, stepping into the darkness of the warehouse with Max at his side. The air inside smelled stale, like something long abandoned. The distant sound of dripping water echoed off the walls as Keanu scanned the large, empty space. Shadows stretched across the room, and in the far corner he could make out the faintest outline of a figure. "Keanu!" a voice called, low and steady from the darkness. It wasn't the detective. And as Keanu's heart raced, he realized one painful truth. The answers he'd been searching for were here, but so were the dangers he'd been running from. Keanu's hand instinctively went to the small of his back where his gun was holstered, though he didn't plan to draw it unless absolutely necessary. Max, walking silently by his side, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. The dog's hackles were raised, his posture taut, ready for any danger that might come their way. Keanu's every sense was on high alert, the hairs on the back of his neck standing up as he stepped deeper into the darkness of the warehouse. The voice from the corner spoke again, this time with a certain calm authority that sent a chill down Keanu's spine. "Keanu," it said, "you don't need to be afraid." Keanu's eyes scanned the room, but the figure remained hidden in the shadows, a silhouette barely visible against the far wall. Keanu's breath caught as he instinctively reached for the flashlight in his jacket pocket, flicking it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing the figure of a man standing motionless in the corner. He was tall, dressed in black tactical gear, and his face was obscured by a hood and a scarf. But what struck Keanu most were the eyes. Cold and calculating, yet strangely familiar. There was something about the man that seemed to echo a distant memory, but Keanu couldn't place it. "Who are you?" Keanu called out, his voice steady, though inside his heart was racing. He could feel Max's tense energy beside him, as if the dog was trying to communicate a warning. The man stepped out of the shadows, his boots making no sound on the concrete floor. As he did, a sliver of light revealed something that made Keanu's breath catch. On the man's arm was a tattoo, a faded insignia that looked like the logo of a special police unit. Keanu had seen it before, but only once, on the badge he had found earlier. "I'm someone who knows about your dog, Mr. Reeves," the man said, his voice a deep monotone. "And I know that you've been asking questions you shouldn't be." Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't said a word about Max's past to anyone, not even to the detective. How did this man know? Max growled low, the sound almost imperceptible, but Keanu felt it, an undercurrent of tension. The dog knew this man, too, but how? Keanu's thoughts raced, but he didn't let his guard down. "Who the hell are you?" Keanu demanded, stepping forward, keeping Max by his side. His instinct screamed at him to get answers, to understand the connection between this man and the mysterious badge, but every step forward felt like walking deeper into a trap. The man's lips curled into a slight smirk. "Oh, you really don't know, do you? Max has been with you for a long time, hasn't he?" Keanu's mind reeled. "What do you mean? Max was a rescue dog. He was just a shelter dog before I found him." The man shook his head, his smirk fading. "Max wasn't just some shelter dog. He's a former K9 unit officer. And he didn't just find you, Mr. Reeves. You found him for a reason. The reason you're both here now." Keanu's stomach twisted. This was too much. Max, his loyal dog who had always seemed so simple, so straightforward, had a hidden past, one tied to law enforcement, to something far darker than he could have imagined. Keanu's gaze shifted to Max, who stood at attention, his eyes unblinking, as if he too was waiting for the next move in this strange puzzle. "Max was part of a K9 unit?" Keanu asked, almost whispering. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. All the pieces that didn't make sense before, Max's unwavering loyalty, his ability to sense danger, were now falling into place. "The man nodded. "Yes, but that's just the beginning. You're connected to something much larger now, something bigger than you or me. This whole mess, it started with a mission Max was part of." Keanu's head spun. "What mission? What are you talking about?" His voice was sharp with frustration, but he needed the answers. This man was toying with him, but Keanu couldn't afford to play games anymore. The figure sighed, as if Keanu's confusion was something he had expected. I'm sure you've heard of a task force called the Ghosts. They were a specialized team of ex-military and ex-police officers, used for covert operations that never saw the light of day. The kind of operations that can't be traced. Max was one of their best dogs, trained to detect explosives, drugs, and even illegal arms. He was part of their operations for years, but there was a complication. Keanu stepped closer, unable to hide his shock. Max, a part of covert military operations, it didn't make sense. How could the dog he knew, the one who loved to curl up on the couch with him and chase after tennis balls, have been involved in something like that? The complication? Keanu pressed, his voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression hardened. The Ghosts went rogue. They became more than just a team, they became a network with a mission that was no longer about protecting people, but manipulating power. And Max? He was part of their downfall. He was the one who exposed them, and they knew it. That's why he was abandoned. Keanu could feel his pulse in his throat. He looked down at Max, who remained motionless at his side, his eyes scanning the warehouse as if he had heard everything, but understood more than Keanu ever could. "This is crazy," Keanu muttered, shaking his head. "You're saying my dog was part of some covert task force, and now these men are after us because of him?" The man nodded again. "Exactly. They've been tracking Max, and they'll stop at nothing to get him back. It's not just about you anymore, Mr. Reeves. You're in this whether you want to be or not." Max barked sharply, and the sound reverberated through the warehouse. It was as though the dog understood the weight of what was at stake. His growl deepened, more threatening now, and Keanu could feel the change in the air. It wasn't just the man in front of them that was dangerous. It was everything surrounding them. "You can't protect him forever," the man said, his voice cold and final. "They'll come for you too, and when they do, there's nothing you can do to stop them." Keanu's mind raced. His thoughts were a blur of disbelief and fear, but there was something else, something burning deep inside him, a sense of duty to protect Max, no matter the cost. The past few hours had turned his world upside down, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He couldn't walk away from this. Not now, not with Max by his side. "Then I'll stop them," Keanu said, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the man. "I'll do whatever it takes." Max stood tall beside him, his eyes fierce as though agreeing with Keanu's words. They were in this together now, partners in every sense of the word. The man took a step back, his gaze flickering with something like admiration or perhaps resignation. "Then you've just made the biggest mistake of your life." Keanu didn't respond. He turned toward the exit, pulling Max along with him, the weight of the unknown heavy on his shoulders. He didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was clear. He was going to fight, and he was going to fight for Max. And whatever shadows lay ahead, he wasn't going to face them alone. Keanu's heart thudded in his chest as he moved swiftly. Through the dark warehouse, Max close at his side, the dog's sharp eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. His mind raced, trying to process the last few minutes, the truth that had just been revealed to him. Max, his dog, his best friend, had once been part of a covert police operation. It felt impossible, but the evidence was too overwhelming to ignore. The man, the one with the tattoo of the Ghosts, had been clear. There were forces out there who wanted Max back, and they would stop at nothing to get him. But why? What had Max seen or done to make him a target? The questions piled up, but answers were still just out of reach. They moved quickly now, Keanu's footsteps muffled by the damp concrete as he led Max through the labyrinth of abandoned structures that made up the warehouse district. The stillness around them felt oppressive, as though the very air was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Max was on high alert. His body was stiff, his ears perked, and his gaze never wavered from the shadows. Keanu had learned to trust the dog's instincts over the years, but today actually, felt different. Max wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a survivor, of something far darker than Keanu could have imagined. And that bond, whatever it had been built on, had just become the most important thing in Keanu's life. Keanu took out his phone, quickly scanning for any updates. The detective's warning still rang in his ears. Don't trust anyone, but who else was there to trust? The people after Max clearly knew more than Keanu did, and this was a fight Keanu had no intention of walking away from. The screen of his phone lit up with a new message. "You're not alone. There's a safe house on the outskirts of town. Go." There now. They're already on your trail. Keanu's breath hitched. Safe house? Who was sending this? He could only hope it wasn't another trap, but something told him that whoever was behind the message was genuine. Keanu turned to Max, giving the dog a silent command. Max let out a low, almost imperceptible growl, his stance tense as they both glanced around. They had to move quickly. They made their way down the dark alley toward the exit of the district, where Keanu's car was parked. Every creak and groan of the old building around them seemed to echo too loudly, reminding Keanu that they were running out of time. As he reached for the door handle of his car, he suddenly heard it, footsteps, light but purposeful, from the direction they'd just come. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. He cursed under his breath. They were being followed. He had no idea if it was the man from the warehouse or someone else, but they were too close for comfort. Max's growl deepened, and Keanu could see the dog's body trembling with anticipation. He didn't need to look back to know Max was ready for whatever threat was coming. Keanu's instincts kicked in. He shoved Max into the car first, slamming the door shut, and then jumped into the driver's seat, his hands shaking slightly as he gripped the wheel. The engine roared to life as he slammed his foot on the gas, tires screeching against the cracked pavement. He didn't know where the safe house was, not exactly, but the message had given him a rough location. He would follow it, no questions asked. The headlights cut through the foggy streets as he sped through the night, weaving in and out of the traffic that seemed to slow in his wake. Behind him, a black SUV came into view. Keanu's eyes widened. He knew that vehicle. It was the same SUV he'd seen earlier in the parking lot, the one with the tinted windows. Whoever was inside, they were closing in fast. "Hold on, Max," Keanu muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on the wheel. The world outside the car felt like it was moving in slow motion, the city lights flashing by in streaks as his mind raced, plotting his next move. Max's head darted toward the rearview mirror, his eyes sharp and unwavering as the SUV drew closer. Keanu could hear the low growl emanating from the dog's chest. Max was ready to protect. Keanu's mind raced. He needed to shake them off. The last thing he wanted was to lead these people to the safe house. He couldn't afford to let them get too close, not yet. Ahead there was a sharp turn, an old overpass that would give him the opportunity to lose the SUV if he played it right. Keanu's heart thumped in his chest as he floored the accelerator. The car shot forward, tires squealing as they approached the turn. He braced himself, hands gripping the wheel tightly as the car's momentum carried them into the curve. Max barked sharply, as if urging Keanu to hurry. Keanu pushed the car to its limits, drifting through the turn, narrowly missing a streetlight. The SUV followed closely behind, but it was slower to make the turn, and for a brief moment Keanu thought he might have lost them. But it wasn't over yet. The SUV revved its engine and surged forward, still tailing them through the winding streets. Keanu's eyes flicked from the rearview mirror to the road ahead, calculating his next move. He needed to get to the safe house, and fast. As they neared the outskirts of town, the streets began to thin out, and Keanu could see the outline of the safe house ahead, an old, weathered building that stood isolated at the end of a narrow road. It wasn't much, but it was their only shot. Keanu's foot slammed on the brakes as he pulled into the dirt driveway, tires crunching on the gravel. The SUV screeched to a halt behind him, and Keanu quickly got out of the car, pulling Max by his leash. "Stay close," Keanu muttered to the dog, his eyes scanning the surrounding area. The safe house was unassuming, but it felt like their last chance. Max's growl deepened, his body stiffening as the sound of footsteps drew nearer. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. They weren't alone. The moment he stepped onto the porch of the safe house, the door swung open, revealing a figure standing in the dim light. Keanu froze, but his instincts kicked in. He wasn't about to walk into another trap. The figure spoke, voice low and calm. "Keanu, we've been expecting you. You need to get inside now." Keanu didn't hesitate. He grabbed Max's collar, ushering him through the door before he stepped in himself, slamming it shut behind them. The room was dark, the only light coming from a few dim bulbs hanging from the ceiling. Max immediately settled down by Keanu's side, his eyes still watchful, scanning for threats. Keanu exhaled, but the relief was short-lived. There was a long road ahead, and he wasn't sure who he could trust anymore. But for the first time since this nightmare began, he had a brief moment of hope, and it was Max who had led him here. They were safe, for now. But Keanu knew this was just the beginning. The room inside the safe house was small, dimly lit, and smelled faintly of stale air and old wood. Keanu glanced around as he closed the door behind him, the heavy sound of the lock clicking into place echoing in the silence. Max, still alert, sat at Keanu's side, his ears perked up, ready for anything. Keanu took a deep breath, trying to calm the racing pulse in his chest. They had made it to safety, at least for the moment, but nothing felt certain anymore. The shadowy figures following them were relentless, and if the man from the warehouse was right, things were about to get much worse. "Who are you?" Keanu asked, his voice hoarse, not quite trusting the situation. The figure standing in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light, stepped forward. A tall woman dressed in dark tactical gear with a hood pulled low over her face. She moved with an air of confidence, like someone used to being in control. Keanu couldn't help but notice the way she scanned the room as she approached. She was assessing everything, just like Max did. "My name is Elena," she said quietly, her voice smooth but with an edge of authority. "I was the one who sent the message." Keanu studied her closely, instinctively placing his hand on Max's back as the dog gave her a curious but cautious glance. "How do I know I can trust you?" Keanu's voice was a little harsher than he intended, but the weight of the night's events had pushed him past any pretense of politeness. His whole world had been turned upside down. One minute he was just another Hollywood actor, and now he was fighting for his life and the life of his dog. Elena met his gaze without hesitation, her dark eyes sharp and calculating. "Because, like you, I'm trying to survive," she replied, simply. "We both want the same thing, to get out of this alive. You think the people after you are after Max, but it's bigger than that. It's about control, power, and right now, those men are the least of your worries." Keanu frowned. "What do you mean it's bigger than that?" She took a slow step forward, her presence commanding. "You don't know who you're dealing with, Keanu. The ghosts aren't just some rogue police unit. They were a part of something much larger. And Max?" She glanced at the dog, who was still sitting perfectly still, watching her. "Max was a witness to something that could bring them all down. That's why they want him so badly. Has a key player in a game you don't even know you're involved in." Keanu's thoughts scrambled. Max? A key player in some secret war? His mind raced with the weight of Elena's words. What was he missing? Why hadn't he been told any of this before? It felt like every time he thought he was starting to piece things together, more questions popped up, dragging him deeper into a web he couldn't untangle. "Why me?" Keanu finally asked, his voice strained. "Why bring me into this? I'm just an actor. I have nothing to do with whatever this is." Elena's eyes softened just for a second before her expression hardened again. "You're not just an actor, Keanu. Not anymore. You're tied to this now because of Max, and Max was brought to you for a reason." Keanu shook his head, frustration bubbling up. "You're not making any sense." "I know," Elena replied. "But you will soon enough." A loud crash from outside the door cut through the air, sending both Keanu and Max into alert mode. The dog's body went rigid, a low growl escaping his throat as his eyes locked on the door. Keanu's heart skipped a beat. "They've found us," Elena said, her voice calm but with a hard edge of urgency. "They've been tracking you for days. We don't have much time." The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the hallway outside. Keanu's pulse quickened as he turned toward Elena, his thoughts racing. Who were these people, and why was he caught in the middle of all of it? "Get ready," Elena said, moving toward a corner of the room where a small door led deeper into the building. "We need to move now." Max stood up at Keanu's side, his hackles raised, ready for whatever came next. Keanu didn't question Elena's command. He grabbed Max's leash and followed her quickly through the hidden door, into a narrow hallway. The air felt thick with tension as they moved through the dark, abandoned building, every step echoing too loudly in the quiet. "What's the plan?" Keanu whispered, his voice low, his instincts kicking into high gear. The quiet hum of adrenaline was running through his veins now. There was no going back. He was in this, for better or worse. Elena glanced over her shoulder. "The plan is simple. Get you out of here. We need to get to the underground tunnels. There's an exit there that leads to a secure location. It's the only way we can lose them." Keanu nodded, trusting her words more than he wanted to admit. He had no other choice. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but there was a part of him, something deep inside, that refused to give in. He couldn't let Max down, not after everything. The group moved swiftly, down the long hallway, and then into what appeared to be a large underground chamber. The dim light of a single bulb illuminated the rusty industrial pipes that ran along the walls. It was grim, but it was their only chance. "This way," Elena said, leading them toward a set of metal stairs that spiraled downward. Keanu didn't hesitate, stepping forward, trying to keep Max calm as they descended. Max's ears twitched at every sound, his senses alert as always. At the bottom of the stairs, Elena led them to a large metal door. She punched in a code on a keypad beside it, and the door slid open with a heavy groan. Inside was an even darker space, a tunnel that seemed to stretch into infinity. Keanu felt the air shift as the cool, musty breeze hit his face. "Stay close," Elena warned. "This tunnel leads to a safe house on the other side of town. We'll be safe there, but we need to move fast. If they're not already here, they'll be coming soon." Keanu nodded, his grip tight on Max's leash as they stepped into the tunnel. The darkness seemed to close in around them, swallowing up the light from the open door behind them. He could feel the pounding of his heart in his chest as he moved forward, each step echoing in the stillness of the underground world. Max, ever vigilant, moved silently at Keanu's side, as if the dog could feel the same unease. They were on the run, but they weren't alone anymore. Keanu had Elena and whoever else was part of this underground network on his side. But even with that, a part of him knew that the real battle was just beginning, and the people chasing them, they were going to stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Keanu's thoughts turned to Max. The dog wasn't just some pet. He wasn't just a companion. Max was something far more valuable than Keanu had realized, and now Keanu was going to have to protect him with everything he had. The further they descended into the tunnel, the more the world outside seemed to slip away. The staleness of the air filled Keanu's lungs as he glanced over at Max, who was moving with quiet precision. It was strange, the way the dog seemed to be attuned to everything, every shift in the environment, every sound in the distant darkness. Keanu had always known Max to be intelligent, but now he was more than that. Max was a lifeline, a partner, and something far beyond just a dog. Elena led them confidently through the winding passageways, her footsteps echoing softly in the cold silence of the underground labyrinth. Keanu followed closely, barely taking a breath as his mind spun with everything he had learned so far. Max had been a part of something huge, something secret, something dangerous. The ghosts, the people, who wanted Max back. They weren't just criminals. They were part of something far bigger. They were soldiers in a covert operation that had been running in the shadows for years. And now Keanu was caught right in the middle of it. He glanced at Elena, his voice barely a whisper. What are the ghosts really after? What's so special about Max? Elena's eyes flickered ahead of her, her jaw tightening slightly. Max has seen things, Keanu, things that were never meant to be seen. He's a witness to events that could tear apart some very powerful people. They want him because he knows too much, and because they can't let anyone expose what they've been doing. Keanu swallowed hard, his throat dry. He felt the weight of her words, but part of him still couldn't comprehend it all. Max, his dog, a witness to what? What could a dog possibly know that would be so important? How do you know all of this? Keanu asked, his voice hoarse, his mind still grasping for any semblance of clarity. Elena slowed her pace, her eyes flicking back to him. Because I was part of it. Not directly, but I knew people who were. People who aren't around anymore. People who knew about Max's past and they were trying to protect him. But now it's too late. Keanu felt a chill run down his spine. You were involved? Elena nodded, her expression darkening. I was part of a group trying to take down the ghosts, but things went sideways. A lot of people died. The people who were supposed to protect Max, they failed. Now it's up to you to make sure he's safe. The truth hit Keanu like a ton of bricks. Elena wasn't just some stranger, guiding them through a dark tunnel. She was a part of the war Max had unknowingly stepped into. She knew the stakes. She knew the danger. And more importantly, she knew that their survival depended on one thing: Max. Suddenly, the tunnel seemed to feel smaller, more oppressive, as if the walls were closing in. Keanu glanced at Max again, who was still walking silently, alert and unwavering, like the dog was already preparing for what was to come. The deeper they went, the more Keanu realized that his life had been irrevocably changed. He wasn't just a civilian anymore. He wasn't just a bystander. He was caught up in a fight that had been going on long before he even knew Max. As they walked in silence, Elena paused at the far end of the tunnel, her sharp eyes scanning the air. Keanu could hear it too, something faint, a sound of movement. From further down the path, "They're close," Elena murmured. "Too close." Keanu's heart thudded in his chest. He grabbed Max's leash tighter, his breath quickening. The dread was starting to settle in his bones now. The enemies chasing them were relentless, and no matter how many turns they made, it felt like the walls were closing in faster. "We can't stop," Elena said, her voice growing more urgent. "There's a breach point ahead, another exit. If we can make it there, we'll be safe, but we need to hurry." Max's ears perked, his body tense. The dog's instincts were sharp, more acute than Keanu had ever noticed before. The fact that Max had survived this long, and survived so much only to end up in this situation, it seemed like fate had a cruel sense of humor. Keanu nodded, urging Max forward. They moved quickly now, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground beneath them. The tunnel stretched ahead in near darkness, with only the faint glimmer of light from Elena's flashlight cutting through the gloom. But Keanu knew they didn't have much time. The air felt thicker the deeper they went, the sense of urgency rising with every passing second. Suddenly, Elena came to a stop, her hand raised in a silent command. Keanu instinctively followed her lead and halted, his eyes darting to the shadows ahead. "What is it?" Keanu asked quietly, his pulse quickening. "Look," Elena said, her voice tight. She pointed ahead, where a small crack in the tunnel wall was visible, just large enough for someone to slip through. But there was something else there too, a shadow, a figure. Keanu's breath caught in his throat. Max growled, low and threatening, as the figure stepped into the weak light of the tunnel. It was a man dressed in black tactical gear, his face obscured by a balaclava. His eyes locked onto Keanu and Max, and the expression behind the mask was chilling. "Elena," Keanu whispered, his voice strained. "Who is that?" Elena's eyes narrowed. "It's one of them," she said, her voice steady but filled with tension. "A ghost." Keanu could feel the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The man was part of the operation, the same people who had been hunting them, and now they had found them. Max let out another deep growl, more intense now. Keanu instinctively stepped in front of the dog, his body tense and ready. This wasn't just a game anymore. They were fighting for their lives. The ghost stepped forward, and Keanu took a step back, his heart hammering. The tunnel felt too small now, too confined, with nowhere to go. "Give me the dog," the ghost said, his voice low and threatening. Keanu's grip tightened on Max's leash. "Over my dead body." The ghost didn't flinch. "You'll never make it out of here alive without him. Hand him over now." Elena shifted, positioning herself next to Keanu. "You don't want to do this." For a moment, there was a tense silence broken only by the steady growl of Max, whose fur was bristling in anticipation. Keanu could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating. He was out of options. They were trapped. And unless they could somehow turn the tide in their favor, the fight for Max and their lives was just beginning, and Keanu had no intention of losing. The air in the tunnel felt like it was closing in on them, suffocating them with the weight of their predicament. Keanu's heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively pulled Max closer to him, his grip on the leash steady, yet his mind raced with what to do next. The figure in front of them, this ghost, was no mere thug. This was someone trained to take down anyone who stood in his way. Max's growl grew deeper, resonating through the small confined space as the ghost moved closer, his boots scraping against the ground in the quiet, oppressive atmosphere. The man's eyes narrowed, staring through the mask at Keanu and Elena. The tension between them felt as thick as the shadows hanging over the tunnel. "Last warning," the ghost said, his voice cold and detached, like he had done this 1,000 times before. "Hand the dog over. Now." Keanu swallowed hard, feeling the fear churn in his gut, but his instincts kicked in. He wasn't going to let them take Max, not without a fight. He took a steadying breath, trying to calm the storm of emotions inside him. He couldn't let fear control him now, not when it meant his survival and Max's. "Not happening," Keanu said through gritted teeth. He felt Elena shift beside him, but he didn't take his eyes off the ghost. Max stood still at Keanu's side, every muscle taut, ready for action. It was clear the dog had already assessed the situation and was waiting for Keanu to give the signal. Keanu knew that just like him, Max wasn't going to back down. The ghost didn't seem to take kindly to the refusal. He lunged forward suddenly, moving with a predator's speed, but Keanu was ready. He reacted faster than he ever thought possible, pulling Max back and pushing Elena behind him, his body instinctively protecting her and the dog. The ghost was quick, too quick, and Keanu barely had time to duck as the man aimed a strike toward his head. The blow missed, grazing past Keanu's shoulder, but it was enough to knock him off balance. He staggered back, but quickly regained, his footing pulling out all the training and instincts he'd picked up over the years, not as an actor, but as someone who had been forced to adapt to survive. Max reacted the moment Keanu was knocked back. The dog lunged forward, snarling, his teeth bared. With incredible speed, he locked onto the ghost's arm, sinking his jaws into the man's forearm. The ghost let out a roar of pain, stumbling back, his hand reaching for his weapon, but Max wasn't letting go. He had the man in his grip now, and Keanu knew that there was no way he'd be able to escape without a fight. "Elena." "Move!" Keanu shouted, his heart hammering as the battle unfolded in front of him. The last thing he needed was to be caught in the middle of a fight with a trained killer. Elena wasted no time. She grabbed Keanu's arm and pulled him away, her movements calculated, pulling him toward a side exit further down the tunnel. She wasn't just running, she was thinking, planning. Keanu could feel the urgency in her grip, and he didn't hesitate to follow her lead. There wasn't much time. Max released his grip on the ghost's arm, but not before the man stumbled and cursed, his face contorted with rage. He turned his attention back to the dog, but Keanu and Elena were already moving. They could hear the sound of the ghost scrambling behind them, but Keanu knew it wouldn't be long before he caught up. Elena pushed through the door at the end of the tunnel, and they found themselves in another dimly lit corridor. There was a muffled sound of footsteps behind them, and Keanu's pulse quickened. They weren't out of the woods yet. "Keep moving," Elena urged, her voice low but firm. She wasn't looking back, but Keanu knew that she was aware of the threat behind them. They ran through the hallways, navigating tight corners and seemingly endless hallways, always a step ahead of the ghost. Max, ever vigilant, was at Keanu's side, guiding him like a compass through the dark, his movements as fluid and calculated as ever. "Where are we going?" Keanu asked, out of breath, as they rounded another corner. "There's a safe room up ahead," Elena replied. "If we can reach it, we'll be able to lock the ghosts out. It's our only chance." Keanu nodded, pushing himself harder, but his mind kept drifting back to the ghost. They couldn't outrun him forever. They had to find a way to end this. The sound of footsteps grew louder again, closer this time. Keanu turned his head slightly, and in the corner of his eye he saw the flash of a dark figure in the hallway behind them. The ghost was catching up. "There!" Eleanor shouted, pointing ahead to a large steel door. "There's the safe room." Max surged forward, his body a blur of muscle and speed, as if he had heard Elena's words. Keanu's heart raced as they reached the door. Elena quickly pulled out a set of keys, fumbling for the right one. Keanu kept his eyes locked on the hallway. Behind them, waiting for the ghost to appear. Max was barking now, a warning growl deep in his chest. Keanu could feel the tension in the air, the weight of everything coming to a head. "Elena, hurry," Keanu urged, his voice tight. With a final turn of the key, the door clicked open, and Elena pushed it wide, ushering Keanu and Max inside. The moment they stepped in, she slammed it shut behind them, locking it with a loud echoing sound. They were inside the safe room, but for how long? Keanu leaned against the door, catching his breath, his chest heaving. Max stood guard beside him, his body rigid, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. Elena was already at the far side, scanning the room for anything that might help them. "We can't stay here long," Elena said, turning to face them. "They'll be looking for us. We need to think of our next move, fast." Keanu nodded, trying to steady his breath. The adrenaline was starting to wear off and the exhaustion was creeping in, but he couldn't afford to stop now. Not when Max's life and his own were on the line. "We fight," Keanu said firmly, his eyes meeting Elena's. "We finish this." Elena raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by his resolve. "You sure you're ready for that?" Keanu glanced down at Max, who was still standing by his side, his loyal companion in the fight. "I have to be. The ghosts hadn't caught them yet, but they would. And when they did, Keanu knew it wouldn't just be a fight for survival. It would be a fight for the truth.